President Cyril Ramaphosa has echoed the African Union's call for the 10-year extension of the AGOA deal. The AU says AGOA's longer extension will ensure the continent's investors. Now, for more on this, we speak to Dr. Jason Musyoka, who is a development economist and CEO of Frontline Group. Thank you very much, Doc, for your time this afternoon. Perhaps let's start with what was envisaged back in the year 2000, in May of that year, and the then President of the United States, Bill Clinton. This was set to be a game changer for countries on the African continent. Has it?
So, firstly, yes, there has been, in 2000, there was tariff lines that were proposed, and the U.S. was really trying to ensure that the tariff lines that were submitted at the time, about 6,800 of them at the time, focused more on Africa, of course, that they would be accepted, or Africa would export duty-free to the U.S. So if you look at most of the reports that look at the impact of the AGOA, then certainly, yes, there has been significant impact on a range of indicators or variables, and this would be, for example, in terms of employment, in the trade industry, in terms of revenue, and in terms of institutional building as well. So these are some of the metrics that you see in most of the reports and literature on the AGOA. There has been significant impact. I also have to say that out of the 54 countries, about 35 of them have signed into it. There are conditions or criteria that is set out, and one of it is that you need to have good governance. You need to ensure that, for example, your labor law meets the U.S. standards. And all of these factors suggest that if you look at the 35 countries that are now that have ratified, it means really that they have passed that criteria. But it has been the impact has been positive by and large over the last 20-some years.
We take a look at the removal of 4 countries this time around. You speak of Uganda, the Central African Republic, Niger, and Gabon. One country, it is said, because of violations of human rights, that being Uganda, because of their anti-LGBTQIA plus stance. And then you take a look at Niger, you take a look at the Central African Republic, you take a look at Gabon. Maybe Niger and Gabon specifically. I mean, when the coups happened, you had people who took to the streets, who are citizens of those countries, who were relieved that maybe something will come for them. And so what is used to determine whether indeed countries do not adhere to human rights or countries do not have good governance? What determines good governance in cases such as Niger and Gabon, maybe?
So the one constant due to that, and in fact, if you look at the 2000 legislation, there is a clause that talks to human rights, and with that, it also talks about U.S. interests, and that's why partly when South Africa was, the allegation between South Africa supplying arms to Russia, there was such a backlash because the question, as far as the AGOA is concerned, keeping in perspective that this has to be agreed upon by the U.S. Congress, so it has and it must serve the U.S. national interests. And part of this interest, as I said, include human rights, include their principles and policies that they put forward. So coming back more directly to your question, the issue of, if you look at Gabon and Niger and Uganda, the issue of what exactly good governance is highly debatable across the board. Is it institutions? Is it what in political science we refer, for example, to as substantive democracy? And that is in between the cycle of elections. Or is good governance just the elections, free and fair elections? And I think that the argument made about just elections as the evidence of good governance is really limiting and a reductionist, so to speak. So all this to say that ultimately, as much as these countries, the U.S. would look at whether they adhere to the principles and the policy interests of the U.S. itself. And I think for Uganda, LGBTQ, regardless of what anyone's perspective is, the U.S. perspective is very clear on that issue. And so are countries like Niger. You had Russia that is supporting, and you have the U.S. that is arguing that you need to have and support the existing, the government that was incumbent at the time. So it has a lot to do with the national interests of the U.S. more than anything else, because ultimately most of these issues, whether it's governance that we grapple with, there are variations of definitions. And for the U.S., the way they define, it really has to align with those definitions. Otherwise, these countries are excluded. So on that basis, because they do not serve U.S. interests, then they were excluded.
You cannot fault the United States for putting their interests first. And then in comes China with the Belts and Road Initiative. Then in comes the African Continental Free Trade Area. You've got the World Trade Organization. And so when you take a look at the interests of countries here on the continent, and it's very nuanced, yes, we understand, who is driving those interests, or what are the interests? Is there not even consensus, but is there a basic idea of what the interests of this here continent is?
One of the troubling issues, Dudu, is perhaps even to take a step back and ask what the African interests really are. And this is the African Union, which if you look at a lot of data, it's really been teethless. It's equivalent to the UN itself, which it's only as powerful as the most powerful members of the UN itself. So African Union has got no power to advance the continental interests, and that is really worrisome. And yet, that the point you mentioned about now the interests, geopolitical interests of the US, of Russia, even of Israel, by the way, in terms of supporting African states, that is happening in almost a vacuum when the AU itself is not really advancing and putting parameters on what can be done and what can't be done in the continent. That is really the sorry state. And I think that perhaps even more radical is emerging literature that suggests that this is colonization or neocolonization 2.0, because it's just taking a different form, but everybody wanting to support, and that's the language that is used, but in actual sense, every country is really advancing its interest, from China to Russia, as I said, to the US itself, and yet we are not clear, we've not really resolved the continental question on our interest as a continent.
At which point is it a curse? At which point is it a choice, Dr. Jason Musyoka? Because what is the unintended, intended consequence in this here continent that is said to be the youngest in terms of youth population?
There are ways in which one can look at the impact of colonization and the fact that there is a lot of literature, for example, in our field of development economics, that looks at how countries have emerged as either strong or weak depending on the colonial powers and the models that were used for colonization. And this has to do with for example, the British, when they colonized, they really supported the local chiefs. This is not by any means to credit colonization, but the model was slightly different from the French. And then you look at the Portuguese, countries that were colonized by the Portuguese as well. So all this to say that colonial model that was used plays a major role in how institutions in our continent have evolved. But I think that, to be fair, I think that unfortunately there is a significant lack or weakness of skills, a lack of skills as far as institutional strength is concerned. It is something that I have consistently argued that in this continent we really need to focus on institutional building. That is a major blind spot in the continent. And if we are really going to go into this geopolitical conflict now that is occurring, a Cold War of sorts, by the way, a second Cold War, one would argue, we are going to get out of this whole equation with nothing. And I think that we need to really build institutions in our continent.
What does that speak to? An absence of leadership? Because also, Dr. Jason Musyoka, I mean, this is something you're probably more aware of, is that people who are not necessarily in government positions play such important leadership roles, and they find themselves not wanting to be caught up in that bureaucratic system where they are not able to make or implement decisions and make unpopular decisions, but that will actually even begin to turn the tide. And so what do we do? What do we put it down to? Is it an absence of leadership, or do we have leaders yet without titles? And if we do, what can those leaders without titles do?
So I think that unfortunately where we have arrived at in this continent, it's an unfortunate situation, number one, so to speak, because we have produced leaders, global leaders, going all the way to Kofi Annan, for example, the former head of the UN. We've produced them, but it's just that we are not producing them for ourselves. We produce them and they go out and serve other interests and economies. And, you can't fault those skills that need to be used out there. So I think that we don't appreciate skills in this continent, and I think that whether that is something that is a cause of how the continent has evolved over time, so that everybody is really just scrambling and with high levels of incompetence as far as political leadership is concerned. And unfortunately, as one of the philosophers argued, that the price we pay for failing to step up as leaders, it is to appoint other leaders who are not able to manage the society. And I think that perhaps it could have a lot to do with really the kind of political skilling that we do, or unskilling that really happens. But I also think, Judo, that this goes all the way back to on micro level, whether it's schools, whether it's in the household. This is where leadership really begins, and it starts with really the basic things: teaching kids how to pick up rubbish, how to be responsible. Ultimately, they then become leaders in society. But I think, in my view, we really fail on the micro level, and then we cast leaders on a national level who themselves are not responsible on a personal level. And I think that is perhaps problematic.
Fair enough. After all, we're in it together for now, at least. Thank you very much to development economist as well as CEO of Frontline Group, Dr. Jason Musyoka.